June 21st, 1893. I had lunch with Laura today, and it felt like a sudden burst of sunlight cutting through the darkness that had come between us. Our conversation reminded me of the early days of our marriage, full of variety and delight, flowing effortlessly from one subject to the next. It was as though we were exploring the depths of each other's minds, sampling thoughts and ideas with ease. If I had such a conversation with a stranger, I'd consider myself lucky, blessed even, to have found such a rare gem of wit and intelligence in the usual dull swamp that passes for polite conversation here in London society. But with Laura, I couldn't help comparing it to the talks we used to have, and something felt off. To an outsider, it might seem like nothing had changed in our marriage, no signs of fading love, no weakening of her assurances of devotion. But for me, something was missing. I can't quite put a name to it, but I feel it as plainly as the beating of my own heart. It's as if the heart and soul we once shared are no longer in sync. Most married couples might tell you their deepest communication happens in the bedroom, and sure, that's been a place where Laura and I have shared passion. But for us, the real fire has always been the meeting of our minds. The places where our souls and intellects connected, the study, the lab, even the living room, those were our true altars, the real cathedral of our love. It's in those spaces where we became something greater together than we ever were alone. I remember the first time we felt this connection. It was almost 2 years before our physical relationship caught up with the bond of our minds. Laura's maiden name was Henry, but we always called her Laura. Her father, Colonel Henry, asked me to tutor her at Bedford College years ago. In exchange for that, he pulled a few strings and got me a position teaching science at a new college in London, one of the rare places that admitted female students. The opportunity was priceless, especially after my premature departure from Cambridge. The colonel also offered me the help of Peter, his former sergeant and a man I had served alongside during my time in Afghanistan. Peter had retired along with the colonel and found work in the Henry household, but quickly realized city life suited him far better than rural life. He was eager to join me and Laura in London. In return for all this generosity, I had to court the most socially awkward of the colonel's 3 daughters. Given my experiences with her older sisters, I fully expected Laura to be another shallow, fashion-obsessed girl whose intellectual ambitions didn't extend beyond local gossip in their small village. But I soon realized Laura was entirely different from her sisters. Where they were empty-headed but socially skilled, Laura was quiet, reserved, and had an almost piercing intellect. I remember our first journey to London. Laura sat on one side of the compartment, and Peter and I were on the other. Peter, worn out from a farewell party the night before, fell asleep almost instantly. I was reading a dense treatise on chemical pharmacology, one of my favorite subjects, but I couldn't focus. Laura kept staring at me with an intensity one found unnerving. At first, I thought she might be mentally dull or overly conservative, and I wasn't optimistic about how well we'd get along. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Miss Henry," I said, looking directly at her, "you've hardly taken your eyes off me since we left the station. Is something wrong with my tie? Is my hair a mess? What exactly is the reason for this constant, and frankly, rather contemptuous attention?" She blushed, her gray eyes widening even more. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly, clearly trying not to wake Peter. "I didn't mean to offend you." Despite my initial frustration, her soft tone caught me off guard. There was something in it that softened my mood. As a scientist, driven by curiosity, I found myself understanding her awkwardness. And, after all, social awkwardness isn't uncommon among intellectuals. In fact, her discomfort made me hopeful about her intelligence. I've spent my life around people who can talk for hours about surgical procedures but couldn't hold a simple conversation about the weather. My annoyance faded, and I began answering her questions, at least the ones suitable for polite conversation. Before long, we were engaged in an unexpectedly pleasant exchange, talking freely as if we had known each other for years. Even Peter woke up, amused by the fact that she had managed to get me talking. Ah, Laura, Peter muttered, stretching, you've done it. You got the doctor to open up. Laura turned to him, her sharp tone echoing her father's military authority. And what do you mean by that, Sergeant? Only that you and the doctor are a perfect match, Peter said with a lazy grin. A brilliant mind and a total inability to communicate. I couldn't help but laugh, growling playfully, you're walking a fine line there, Sergeant. I may have to demand satisfaction for that insult. Peter just grinned wider. Oh, I'm not about to fight the doctor, he said. Not with all I owe you. Besides, you'd probably stitch yourself up after the fight. I rolled my eyes, grinning, while Laura blushed sweetly. The banter continued, and before we knew it, our journey had laid the foundation for what would become a deep, intellectual partnership. By the time we reached London, I saw Laura as more than just a wealthy young woman playing at education. Beneath her reserved exterior, I discovered a brilliant mind and a spirit as adventurous and fearless as my own. Over the next decade, that connection deepened. She started as my assistant in the lab, but soon became my equal. Together, we explored the world of science, often venturing into mysteries no one else dared touch. Our intellectual passion eventually sparked a physical one, igniting a love that healed the wounds Afghanistan had left on my soul. June 28, 1893. But now, things are different. Our relationship is unraveling in ways I don't fully understand. On the outside, Laura is still the devoted wife she's always been, but I can feel her drifting away from me. Our conversations often die in the middle, and more often than not, I find her staring out the window, lost in thoughts that no longer include me. Even Peter and Mrs. Willoughby, our housekeeper, seem to have picked up on the shift, quietly avoiding us when we're alone. The cheerful home we once had has turned cold and silent. Lately, Laura moves as though she's in pain, as if something is wrong with her back or limbs. She's changed the way she dresses too. She used to wear delicate, elegant outfits that we both enjoyed, but now she hides her figure in blouses and long skirts, even when we're alone in the lab. In the bedroom, she's replaced her light, flowing nightgowns with heavy, flannel ones that cover her from head to toe, like an elderly churchwoman. Despite this, she still fulfills her marital duties, but it's with a grim sense of obligation, not the passion we once shared. She no longer undresses fully, preferring to lift her nightgown just enough for me to access her body. It's become mechanical, and her once joyful presence in the bedroom now feels like a distant memory. I've begun to think of seeking affection elsewhere, something I never imagined I would consider. But I won't force my needs on a woman who no longer seems willing. What once brought light to my days and filled my dreams has now turned our nights into something cold and painful. As if this weren't enough, my dreams have grown darker too. They've always been haunted by the ghosts of my time in Afghanistan, but now something new has entered them, something equally terrifying and seductive, as though these nightmares have become a reflection of the growing distance between Laura and me. July 5, 1893. Lately, I've been falling asleep earlier than usual, and even though I sleep longer, I wake up feeling more drained than ever. No matter how many hours I rest, every morning I'm met with the same exhaustion. It's not just physical, it's a weariness born from the dullness and monotony that have slowly overtaken my life. I can't help but shudder when I think about what my days are turning into. As passion continues to fade from my marriage, my home, and my very existence, I find myself questioning what unseen forces are at work here. Is this simply the natural course of middle age? Does the frenetic energy of youth inevitably give way to the sluggish rhythm of routine and maturity? Will my life now be reduced to 3 mornings a week at Bedford College, lecturing overweight students who seem more suited to dissection tables than to becoming future surgeons? Afternoons at the club are no better, empty conversations with men whose wealth and titles barely conceal their lack of wit or originality. And then there are dinners with Laura, who has replaced the poetic language of our early days with idle gossip about neighbors and occasional remarks on home decor. Sometimes, I wonder if all the Henry sisters are truly cut from the same cloth. My only refuge is in the lab, where the soft glow of the Bunsen burners and the swirling colors of the chemical solutions offer some solace. Yet, even here, my joy feels dulled, a once bright fire now struggling to stay lit in a world that seems increasingly drab and lifeless. July 8, 1893. This morning, I barely brushed Laura's arm as she passed me in the dining room, and she recoiled, hissing in pain. She quickly masked it with a tight smile, muttering something about a woman's ailment. Does she think I've forgotten my medical training? The old, debunked theories of hysteria and wandering wombs hold no weight with me. I know well enough that there are few conditions that would cause such tenderness in a healthy woman. Something is amiss. I need to investigate further. July 13, 1893. Part of the mystery has been uncovered, though I fear it's brought us closer to an even greater one. Laura continues to walk gingerly through the house, wincing as if every step causes her discomfort, and her condition seems to be worsening. For over a week, I've watched her in pain, and when I finally asked, she snapped back at me, saying she suffers from women's ailments. Still, she refuses all medications, and the situation grows more perplexing with each passing day. Meanwhile, my nights have become stranger, filled with unsettling dreams that seem to stretch on forever. Lately, I've been falling asleep earlier and earlier, barely staying awake past 8 in the evening, and yet I can hardly drag myself out of bed before 10 the next morning. But last night, I resolved to stay awake long enough to learn more. I changed my routine, swapping my usual brandy for wine and cocoa. For Laura, I added a few drops of laudanum to her favorite drink, hoping to lull her into a deeper sleep. The wait was excruciating. Laura seemed determined to stay awake, as if she wanted to make sure I went to bed before she did. Several times, I caught her eyeing me with a sly, almost calculating look. It was strange, her desire to follow me to bed when our activities there have been so strained lately. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Laura succumbed to sleep. I waited another half hour, fighting off my own fatigue, before quietly making my way to the bedroom. I brought a lantern with me, closing 3 of its 4 panes to let only a faint flicker of light escape. With trembling hands, I lifted her nightgown. To my horror, I saw dark bruises marring the pale skin of her thighs, continuing up her torso and blossoming on her chest and sides. My heart sank. Red welts streaked across her body, the kind that no illness or woman's ailment could explain. My hands trembled as I touched the marks, trying to make sense of them. They were warm to the touch, but they were real. I wasn't imagining this. A wave of fear and exhaustion washed over me, dragging me under. I barely had time to place the lantern on the bedside table before darkness claimed me. July 15, 1893. 2 days have passed since that terrible night. I've spent these days drifting aimlessly around the university after my lectures, hiding in the club until late at night, hoping that the idle chatter of my colleagues might drown out the thoughts gnawing at my mind. I've been clinging to the hope that what I saw wasn't real, that it was just another figment of my disturbed imagination, another trick played by the nightmares that have plagued me for so long. But the nights have been filled with dark, violent dreams, haunted by ghosts from my past. Every morning, I wake feeling more tired than when I went to bed, as if sleep itself has become a battleground. And today, something happened that chilled me to the bone. A note appeared in my diary, written in rough, careless letters, nothing like my own handwriting. Dear Henry, Laura belongs to me. I'll take her whenever I please. Yours forever, Edward Hyde. Excerpts from the memoirs of Laura Henry. I remember the first time I saw Henry Jekyll. His eyes, icy blue and sharp, are what stand out most in my memory. It was 1881, at a reunion of my father's regiment, long before I attended Bedford College, long before London, and long before I met Edward Hyde. The reunion was planned to celebrate the first anniversary of my father's return from Afghanistan. The colonel, Baron Henry of Hayward, had recovered from the injuries he sustained in battle but was still too weak to travel far, so we hosted the event at our family estate in West Hayward. The weekend was to be filled with hunting, feasting, and dancing, while the veterans could reunite and reminisce about old comrades. As Miss Austen once wrote, it is a truth universally acknowledged, that a young woman in possession of a fine dress must be in want of a dance partner. And so, girls from all over the county arrived at our house, eager to flaunt their finery and catch the eye of any eligible young men in attendance. The house was alive with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses, and the ballroom was full of dancers moving gracefully across the floor. Although the gaiety was intoxicating, I chose to join my father in the salon, where he had gathered with his old companions for port and cigars. Their conversation was filled with talk of battles, fallen friends, and the shared language of soldiers, a language I couldn't fully understand but was drawn to nonetheless. As I listened to them speak, I wondered what terrible things they had seen in those faraway lands, and how those experiences had changed them. The changes in my father were obvious. Before he left for the war, he had been a robust, sociable man, full of life. When he returned, he was a shell of himself, a sad, broken figure with a shattered hip and a nearly useless arm. His body had slowly healed, but his spirit seemed to be lost somewhere on the battlefield. Among the veterans was a man who caught my attention, Henry Jekyll. He stood out from the others, if only because of the intensity in his gaze. His eyes, cold and fierce, moved from face to face as though he were searching for something, genius, humor, intelligence, I couldn't tell. For a moment, those icy eyes landed on me, but just as quickly, he looked away, leaving me both offended and relieved. I wondered why he dismissed me so easily. Was it because I was young? Because I was a woman? Did he see me as nothing more than a pretty ornament, something to be observed and not engaged with? Whatever it was Henry Jekyll sought, he didn't find it that night. And though I felt a sense of relief, I couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to be truly seen by a man like him, to be recognized as worthy. I often wondered if one day I might be the person Henry Jekyll's gaze would linger on, someone in whom he could find fulfillment. That was Henry Jekyll. But I still remember vividly the first time I laid eyes on Edward Hyde. It was late at night in 1885, a year after Dr. Jekyll, Peter, Mrs. Willoughby, and I had moved to London, and I had just started my studies at Bedford College. I had gone to bed early, worn out from a long day in the lab and an evening spent studying. Just as I was drifting off, I was startled awake by the sound of raised voices coming from downstairs. "Leave me alone," a rough, grating voice shouted. "I need to get the documents I left in the laboratory." "I don't know you, sir." "You need to leave the house immediately," Peter's stern voice responded. "I am Mr. Edward Hyde," the stranger growled. "I'm here at Dr. Jekyll's request." "You have no right," Peter interrupted. "Dr. Jekyll isn't home at the moment. You can come back tomorrow if he's ready to see you then." "But it'll be too late." "It's too late." Hyde's voice rasped. It was harsh and hoarse, but oddly magnetic, as if every word was both a complaint and a seduction at once. Even before I saw the man, I could sense something repulsive yet strangely attractive about him. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slipped quietly to the top of the stairs, peering down to watch the confrontation. Peter was forcefully guiding the man toward the door, but before he left, Hyde turned around, his gaze locking onto mine. His eyes, dark brown, like those of a predator, swept over me, lingering far too long. I felt as if I was being sized up, but not with the politeness of a gentleman or the pride of a teacher. No, this was something far more animalistic, a gaze that drank me in, scanning my chest, my thighs, my stomach with an unsettling hunger. He smiled then, a smile that sent a chill through me, one that was feral and devoid of warmth. "Hello, he began, but before he could finish, Peter shoved him out the door, slamming it behind him. Peter turned to me sharply. "Laura, you shouldn't be here. Go back to your room, now." Without a word, I hurried away. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the memory of Edward Hyde's eyes. That raw, greedy desire I saw in them stirred something within me, a reluctant thrill that, to my shame, I couldn't ignore. I imagined what it would be like to give in to that hunger, to satisfy that primal need. It was a disturbing thought, yet it clung to me all the same. Later, when I came to understand the twisted relationship between Henry Jekyll and Edward Hyde, I was astounded that it had taken me so long to see the connection. I had spent enough time with both of them to remember every detail of their appearance, their ears, their noses, their mouths and hair. Their teeth were practically identical. Yet despite these physical similarities, Henry Jekyll and Edward Hyde couldn't have been more different. They were like two souls trapped in the same body, but so opposed to one another that it was as if they lived in entirely separate worlds. On one side was Jekyll, an angel, cold, commanding, and controlled. On the other was Hyde, a demon, fiery, impulsive, and wild. From the way they carried themselves to the expressions on their faces, nothing linked the two, no thread connecting the noble doctor to the beastly creature. It was as though one was the prince of civilization and the other the king of savagery. Although I had first seen Henry Jekyll in 1881, he hadn't truly noticed me until 3 years later. In that time, I had learned something about the man, and his once spotless reputation had dimmed somewhat. My father had always spoken highly of him. A graduate of Edinburgh University Medical School, Jekyll had been celebrated for his brilliance and dedication, even considered a genius by those who knew him. After his graduation in 1878, it was expected that he would either establish a private practice, join a prestigious hospital, or become a professor at a respected university. But Jekyll defied those expectations. Driven by youthful idealism, he enlisted in the British Army, eager to apply his medical skills for the good of the empire. His service was exemplary, earning distinction at the battles of Al-Masjid and Tarab. After the Treaty of Gandamak, he was assigned to my father's regiment, where he saved both my father's life and that of Sergeant Peter during the disastrous Battle of Maiwand. Though Jekyll rarely spoke about his time in the military, it was clear that it had left an indelible mark on him. After the war, he once again defied expectations by leaving medical practice to pursue a new course of study in the sciences at Cambridge. It was around this time that I first saw him at my father's regiment reunion. In hindsight, I believe the excitement I saw in his eyes then was fueled by his anticipation of the intellectual journey he was about to begin. However, when we met again 3 years later, that spark had dimmed. Rumors of a scandal circulated as quietly as the whispers about his sudden departure from Cambridge. Though my sisters speculated that Jekyll had been courting the wrong woman or had been caught in some illicit affair, I dismissed their gossip. A look into Jekyll's eyes was enough to tell me that whatever had happened was not a matter of love, but rather of intellect, an offense far deeper than a romantic entanglement. While Dr. Jekyll found himself at a crossroads in his professional life, my family, too, faced its own challenges. The Henry family, part of the landed gentry, had always upheld strict views on social class and propriety. But my father, shaped by his experiences at Sandhurst and in the military, held more progressive views, particularly when it came to the roles of women in the lower classes. Though outwardly conservative, my parents secretly sympathized with the philosophies of Mill, Godwin, and Wollstonecraft, views that, had they been made public, could have jeopardized my father's career. As my father's physical health slowly recovered through time and effort, his spirit required something more. A man of action and purpose, he struggled to find meaning after his retirement from the military. His answer came in the form of Bedford College, where he was appointed to the Board of Trustees. This institution, dedicated to the education of women, was well funded but lacking in prestige, and its mission was seen as controversial at the time. My father's skills and connections proved invaluable, and soon, he became consumed by the task of advancing the college's reputation. His involvement in Bedford College restored some of the vitality and energy that the war had drained from him. At the same time, my own intellectual curiosity was growing. Determined to help my father heal, I scoured our family's library for medical texts, only to find that it was stocked mostly with fiction, poetry, and travelogues. With the exception of a collection of books on butterflies donated by my great-uncle Bertram, there was little in the way of scientific knowledge. Seeking more information, I arranged an informal apprenticeship with our local doctor, Dr. Whitestone. Although he was reluctant to take on an eager young noblewoman as a student, he couldn't refuse the Henry family, and so he begrudgingly allowed me to use his medical library. I devoured the contents with enthusiasm, and soon I was assisting in his practice, even taking over some duties when his fatigue and my determination coincided. Within a year, I had become proficient in suturing, a skill my mother attributed to my childhood love of embroidery. While grateful for Dr. Whitestone's tutelage, I soon became frustrated with the limits of his knowledge. Inspired by the butterfly texts, I began to wonder if there were ways to help my father regain his lost vitality, to accelerate the healing of both his body and spirit. Could the human body, like a butterfly, be transformed through some innate power? In my quest for answers, I also sought the guidance of Mary Draith, a local midwife whose expertise in herbal remedies far surpassed that of Dr. Whitestone. Under her instruction, I gained a deep understanding of female anatomy and treatments for women's ailments, a subject on which Dr. Whitestone was remarkably ignorant. After a few years, I had exhausted all local resources and began searching for opportunities to study beyond our village. By this time, both of my sisters had married well, securing the family's future. With my biological duties fulfilled, I asked my parents for permission to continue my studies at one of the new women's colleges. As a trustee of Bedford College, my father was in a dilemma, torn between his political ideals and his concern for my future. The solution, he decided, lay in Dr. Jekyll. Dr. Jekyll, despite his contentious departure from Cambridge, had an impressive resume, and his battlefield experience gave him a deep understanding of human anatomy and the healing arts. My father arranged for me to begin my education at Bedford College under Dr. Jekyll's supervision. Peter would ensure my safety, while Mrs. Willoughby would oversee propriety as our housekeeper. We all moved into my family's home on Cavendish Square in London. Though I was excited about my studies and the prospect of living in London, Dr. Jekyll's cold demeanor dampened my enthusiasm. As he loaded my luggage for the trip, his indifference was palpable. His gaze, when it landed on me, was devoid of interest, as though I were an afterthought. I was no more than a pale shadow of my sisters, lacking their style and easy, if shallow, charm. Apprehension filled me as we began our journey, knowing I would be spending the day in the company of such a stern and distant man. It didn't take long for tension to rise between us. While I had been noticing his coldness, it seemed that Dr. Jekyll had also been silently judging me, and less than an hour into our trip, he began to question me about my motives for pursuing education. As I continued to study Dr. Jekyll during our tense journey, I found myself stammering through my observations, apologizing nervously. This discomfort eventually melted away as our conversation turned to his work at Cambridge, my own experiences with Mrs. Draith and Dr. Whitestone, and our shared ambitions for Bedford College. What began with mutual hostility evolved into a conversation that laid the groundwork for a friendship, one that would last for years and ultimately lead me to some of the greatest adventures, and deepest tragedies, of my life. Having spent my early years in the quiet countryside of West Hayward, London was a whole new world. I was like a naive country girl dropped into one of the grandest cities on earth, and the adjustment wasn't easy. The bustling streets of Marylebone, where we now lived, became my new village, though it was far more vibrant and chaotic than anything I'd known before. It wasn't the busiest part of the city, but it attracted all kinds, street vendors, beggars, pickpockets, and, to my great unease, women plying their trade on the corners. This world both fascinated and frightened me. I felt overwhelmed, and if it hadn't been for Dr. Jekyll and Peter, who often accompanied me on my walks, I might have been swallowed up by the sheer enormity of it all. London's wonders and horrors were many, and without their guidance, I could easily have gotten lost in the sea of people and madness. Despite the stress of acclimating to the city, I found comfort and purpose at Bedford College. The excitement of the laboratories, the challenge of the classrooms, and the endless resources of the college library were a joy to me. Though my scientific knowledge was rudimentary compared to some, the practical skills I'd learned from Mrs. Draith and Dr. Whitestone set me apart from my classmates. Under Dr. Jekyll's tutelage, I quickly became proficient in the lab, and my growing expertise in biology and botany, fields that interested him less, allowed me to contribute meaningfully to our work. It was an intellectual partnership that gave me a sense of belonging. However, during my second year at Bedford, I began to notice subtle yet alarming changes in Dr. Jekyll. Most days, he still displayed the sharpness and precision that set him apart from others, his mind as clear and exact as his immaculate appearance. Even in civilian clothes, he carried himself with the bearing of a soldier, his collars always perfectly pressed, his hair neatly combed, and his beard meticulously groomed. But as autumn settled in, and the cold began to creep through the streets of Marylebone, that meticulousness started to slip. His once pristine collars became wrinkled, his cravat stained and unkempt. There were days when his face appeared gaunt, hollowed, as if something was draining the life from him. Even more unsettling was the change in his gaze. The cold, searching eyes that once sought out intelligence and insight in others now seemed vacant, lifeless, reminiscent of the emptiness I had once noticed in his military comrades. At times, his sharp mind seemed clouded by fatigue or distraction, and this apathy extended into the laboratory as well. The care and precision that had defined his work were replaced by a lazy disregard for safety. It all came to a head one day when he began adding mercury fulminate to a heated beaker, a procedure so reckless that it could have caused an explosion. Panicked, I ran across the lab and stopped him just in time, grabbing his hand before he could proceed. Anger flared in his eyes, but it was quickly followed by an expression of regret as he realized the danger he'd put us in. "I'm so sorry," he muttered, rubbing his face with a shaky hand. "It's the lack of sleep. I wasn't thinking." It was around this time that Edward Hyde re-entered my life. Although it had been a long time since our first encounter, I occasionally felt the weight of his gaze upon me, a greedy, unsettling presence that seemed to cling to me like a polluted fog. His presence lingered in the air, thick and suffocating, as if I couldn't escape his scrutiny. And as if to confirm my unease, rumors began to circulate through Marylebone about a monster terrorizing the streets. Peter, ever protective, insisted that Mrs. Willoughby and I never walk unaccompanied. He was exhausting himself trying to protect us, his watchfulness strained further by Dr. Jekyll's strange behavior. The doctor began staying out late, often spending nights at Bedford or locking himself away in his basement laboratory. He forbade us from entering his underground chambers and even began eating his meals outside the house. Days would pass without me seeing him, except in passing at the college. Though our conversations remained polite, a palpable distance had grown between us. Things might have continued like this indefinitely, had it not been for my upcoming end-of-semester exams. The pressure to study long hours forced me to stay up late, often working in the living room where the lighting was better. One evening, I was poring over my notes when I heard a strange noise coming from the basement. "Mrs. Willoughby?" I called, thinking she had dropped something, but there was no answer. I continued my studies, but soon the noise grew louder, more insistent, a roar followed by the sound of crashing glass. It was coming from Dr. Jekyll's laboratory. Remembering his strict warnings never to intrude, I hesitated at the top of the stairs, torn between fear and the desire to help. And then I heard a scream. Without thinking, I rushed down to the basement, throwing open the flannel-covered door of the laboratory. The scene before me was chaos. The once orderly space was in complete disarray. Broken glass littered the floor, chemicals spilled across the workbench, and packing crates lay smashed against the walls. The neat rows of tools and materials were now scattered remnants of the doctor's previous precision. But what shocked me the most was the sight of Dr. Jekyll himself. He was convulsing, his body contorting in pain as he clung to the workbench for support. His pale face was twisted in agony, and his eyes, once so sharp, now looked wild with fear. "Laura, no," he croaked, his voice weak and desperate. "Go away. Please, go. I was frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Dr. Jekyll, what's happening? Should I get Peter? No, he shouted, his voice cracking. No, leave me alone. Ignoring his protests, I moved toward him, intent on helping. But as I reached the other side of the table, I realized something horrifying. This wasn't just Dr. Jekyll in pain. His body was changing before my eyes. His limbs twisted, his muscles tensed unnaturally, and then, as he turned toward me, I saw it. His eyes, they were no longer Jekyll's piercing blue. They were dark, predatory, Hyde's eyes. A cruel smile spread across his face, and I stepped back in horror, feeling my heart race in my chest. Where are you going, little sparrow? He sneered, his voice low and menacing. Our reunion has just begun. I stumbled, barely managing to stay on my feet as I backed toward the door. Peter! I screamed, but my voice faltered, fear choking the sound. Hyde stepped closer, his movements predatory, as if he was savoring my fear. His hand shot out, gripping my arm with shocking strength. You don't need to call for anyone, he whispered, his breath hot against my skin. We're perfectly fine just as we are. I was paralyzed, caught between horror and disbelief as he tore at my bodice, his hands moving with a disgusting, invasive familiarity. The world around me blurred, and darkness swarmed in until I could no longer remember anything but the weight of his presence, his eyes locked onto mine, and the overwhelming sensation of helplessness. July 29, 1893. Last night, the dreams returned. Faces, twisted in laughter and agony, flickered through my mind. Lips, slick with saliva, stretched over yellow teeth, mocking me as I stumbled through fog-choked streets. I was floating on a wave of intoxication, my arms outstretched to the silent buildings around me. Their windows, dark and unfeeling, seemed to echo my cries of despair. When I woke, the images clung to me like a fever. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The confusion cleared, and I recognized my bed, my wife sleeping peacefully beside me. With shaking hands, I reached for my diary, flipping through its neat, orderly pages. And there, amidst the familiar handwriting, I found it, the same ugly scrawl as before. Dear Henry. Laura is mine. I'll take her whenever I want. Yours forever, Edward Hyde. This wasn't a nightmare. This was real. Hyde had returned. 7 long years had passed since I last encountered Edward Hyde. I had believed him defeated, banished by the power of love and science. But now, as I stared at his mocking note, I realized the bitter truth: love and science, the two forces in which I had placed so much faith, had failed. Hyde had not been vanquished. He had only been lying in wait, watching, waiting for his chance to return. I've tried to keep my wife, Laura, safe from his grasp. But each night, as the dreams grow darker, I feel the weight of Hyde's presence growing stronger. He's not just haunting my sleep, he's creeping back into my life, taunting me, reminding me of my greatest failure. The very thing I had sworn to keep at bay had slipped through the cracks, and now he was here, claiming what was most precious to me. And Laura, she drifts further away from me with each passing day. I can only imagine the terror and confusion she feels, torn between her commitment to our marriage and the horror of Hyde's violations. How betrayed she must feel, trapped between the man she married and the monster who steals her body in the dead of night. She must feel utterly terrorized, haunted by the demon that now resides in my body, tormenting her endlessly. Every night, she watches over me, always ensuring I go to bed before she does. Is she trying to protect herself, hoping that with her husband asleep, Hyde will stay dormant, and she'll be safe? I don't know, but I suspect it. The guilt eats away at me, knowing the fear she lives with. I've begun scouring through my old lab notes from Cambridge and Bedford, hoping to retrace the steps I took in creating the monster that Edward Hyde has become. Maybe, just maybe, I can find a way to stop him before he takes over completely. But as I read through those pages, I'm confronted with something else, a mirror of who I became during my time in Afghanistan. On the battlefield, I witnessed the extremes of humanity, acts of unimaginable bravery and unforgivable cruelty, often committed by the same hands. It was in Afghanistan that I realized the comforting lies of my childhood, the myth of English superiority and the wisdom of the Church, were just that, lies. We are all the same, no matter our nationality, British, Afghan, Indian, Russian. Within each of us lies the potential for both good and evil, angels and demons intertwined, fighting for dominance. I had entered medicine to impose some kind of order on the world, to be a force for good. But in Afghanistan, those virtuous dreams disintegrated like dust in the wind. I was not the herald of British civilization that I'd imagined. I was no beacon of virtue. I was a weary, blood-soaked tailor, stitching together broken bodies and sewing futures from scraps of flesh. What happened to the dreams I once had? What about the future I had envisioned for myself, becoming a husband, a father, a respected physician, a pillar of the community? That future now feels both too small and far too vast for the man I've become. The Jekyll who once loved humanity, who saw his fellow man as vessels of God's grace, no longer exists. In his place stands a surgeon, cold, clinical, severed from the common threads of humanity by the horrors I've both witnessed and committed. I can never return to the life I once hoped for. It's time to give up those old dreams. I need to look for new ones. If order and justice are ever to prevail, then mankind itself must change. We must find a way to control both the angel and the demon inside each of us, to harness their powers. I envisioned a way to build a door, a separation between the two sides of man. A ladder, like Jacob's ladder, that would allow us to ascend, to fight for our place in heaven and to confront God with the virtue necessary to demand satisfaction. My theology was flawed, perhaps, but my goal was clear. God, or perhaps evolution itself, had brought humanity to this precipice, and I wanted to push it further. To give humankind control over its own destiny. And if that meant going to war with God, so be it. That was the birth of Edward Hyde. August 20th, 1893. I feel Hyde stirring within me again. He's right below the surface, looking through my eyes, evaluating the world as if it's his for the taking. It feels like he's waiting to be born once more, and the weight of his presence is terrifying. At the same time, I keep searching my notes for some way to reverse his revival, to stop him once and for all. When I returned to England after the war, I threw myself into this new quest, much as I had once immersed myself in my studies and surgery. The first step, I decided, was to separate the psyche, to sever the bonds between angel and demon so they could be summoned at will. Once that was achieved, the next challenge was to force the body to evolve to accommodate each side. I theorized that the body, under stress, would adapt to protect itself, so I began to inflict pain to provoke its more aggressive, animalistic side. To evoke the more passive, softer aspects of the psyche, I provided comfort, tricking the body into believing it no longer needed to fight. Looking back on these early experiments, I shudder at their crudeness. Some men, it seems, were born without an angel at all. I don't blame Cambridge for quietly expelling me. I had pushed too far, delving into the darkest parts of the human soul, and in doing so, I had caused permanent harm to several of my subjects. Many of them will never see the outside world again, they will either remain imprisoned or confined to asylums for the rest of their lives. When I left Cambridge, I was adrift. No longer a doctor, no longer a lecturer, no longer employed. I had become a victim of my own ambition. So when Colonel Henry offered me a position at Bedford College, I leaped at the chance. I may not have been able to change the world or humanity's nature, but at least I could do some good in the classroom. At least I could make a difference there. But now, I awake in despair. This is my bed, and Laura sleeps beside me, her presence a constant reminder of the monster lurking within. I feel Hyde's claim on her, on everything I love. Laura spends long hours in her greenhouse on the 3rd floor, surrounded by her plants and potions, isolating herself from me. I remember the events of 8 years ago, but this time, it's different. Now she avoids me, but we still share the same bed. After I found the bruises and bites on her body, I decided to protect her by moving into one of the guest rooms. But my attempt to distance myself was met with violent resistance. She flew into a rage, throwing a china Wedgwood plate at my head. Facing the possible collapse of our marriage, I gave in to her demands to stay in our bedroom. But I can't understand why. Why is she so insistent on sleeping beside me, despite everything? Is she lonely? Ashamed? Or is she afraid to let me out of her sight, knowing that Hyde lurks just beneath the surface, waiting to take control when the sun goes down? Back in Bedford, those years ago, Laura was a balm for my wounded soul. It was with her that I first experienced the thrill of meeting an intellectual equal. Like me, she dreamed of expanding human potential, of transforming the body's ability to heal itself. She envisioned herself as a modern Prometheus, giving mankind the power of the gods, allowing us to take control of our own evolution. I now see that it was inevitable that our passionate intellectual debates would ignite a more carnal passion between us. But at the time, I was still trying to convince myself that our connection was purely of the mind. Yet I couldn't ignore the way I was drawn to her, the gentle curve of her waist, the softness of her skin, the widening of her gray eyes when she was startled. I, who had imagined myself as a monk of science, dedicated to a life of solitary study, now found myself longing for a life of shared passion, a life in the arms of my beloved wife. I was torn. On one side was the logical scientist, desperate to exorcise the ghosts of my past. On the other was the wild, base creature that longed to unleash his passions on Laura. For a time, the doctor within me held the upper hand. Decency, respectability, self-control, those chains tightened around my baser instincts. But they also began to fray. I found myself craving Laura with a hunger that grew stronger each day, an addiction that no amount of alcohol, intellectual rigor, or long hours in the lab could suppress. To protect her, I distanced myself. I spent long nights at the college or holed up in the laboratory. But the more I stayed away, the more my desire for her grew. Deprived of her presence, my mind began to warp her image, making her flaws seem insignificant and her virtues magnified. Fantasies of what could never be filled my thoughts. Desperate for a solution, I turned to my old research. What if I could find a way to release the demon of my earthly desires far away from Laura, sparing her the wrath of the beast within me? After exhausting my passions, I could return to our safe, respectable life, free from the burning hunger that threatened to consume us both. So I threw myself back into my Cambridge experiments, but this time, I became my own subject. September 8, 1893. I wake up in a cold sweat, the remnants of a disturbing dream clinging to my mind. In the dream, Laura, or perhaps Hyde's version of her, was kneeling before me, her hands clasped behind her back, her head lowered in submission. She followed me through the streets like an obedient shadow, doing as I commanded, her eyes betraying her awareness that she was almost entirely mine. She knew this night was only the beginning of another assault, another attempt to break her. And in Hyde's mind, the wall between them would inevitably crumble. When I wake, the sickening sense of Hyde's triumph lingers. His joy at possessing her is overwhelming, and I feel my own despair deepen. Each day, I lose more of her. Each night, I come closer to losing myself. Am I going mad? The human mind isn't designed to be divided like this. We see the world through a single set of eyes, process it through one moral lens. But as my soul fractures, the two forces within me, the cold doctor and the wild adventurer, fight for dominance. The doctor, weighed down by the rules of society, retreats, and in his place rises the hedonistic creature, free of all moral restraint. It's terrifying. I know this is the path I chose when I decided to separate the angel from the demon. And now, my body follows suit. I force myself to endure the poisons, to feel the pain as my body is torn between these two halves. The agony is unbearable, but I had expected that. What I hadn't anticipated was how much Hyde would feed on it, growing stronger with every wave of suffering that coursed through my veins. I screamed, my voice breaking under the strain. The pain stretched on for what felt like an eternity. And then, finally, it stopped. When I opened my eyes, the world around me was clearer, sharper than ever before. I was free, unburdened by the constraints of morality or decency. I was air, light, but also something else, something darker, something free from the chains of human weakness. I laughed once more, and that laugh transformed into a triumphant cry. I leapt to my feet, marveling at the raw power coursing through me. If I jumped high enough, I felt as if I could touch the moon. Our heart pounded, strong, furious, alive, pumping rich blood and desire through our veins. Somewhere deep inside, the small part of me that was still Jekyll wondered if our heart's newfound strength came from the need to overcome the poisons coursing through our body. But another part of me, the part that was Hyde, merely laughed at the thought. It didn't matter where the strength came from, all that mattered was that it was there. Hyde knew he had a powerful heart, a heart of the beast, hungry enough to devour the entire world. The smells of London drifted through the open window, the ripe, raw scent of living flesh filling my nostrils. It was intoxicating. The city lay before me like a feast, dirty and teeming with life, all begging to be consumed. I grabbed our coat and hat, heading out into the night, into the hungry night. As I stepped out, the last remnant of Jekyll inside me closed its eyes and faded, sinking into unconsciousness. When I awoke, I was alone in my head once again, and I was back in control of my body. The memories of the previous night were foggy and scattered, faint images of dark taverns and opium dens, flashes of pleasure so intense they bordered on madness. I recalled the looks of disgust on the faces of those we'd encountered, as if Hyde's very presence repulsed them. It seemed he was instinctively loathsome to others, banished to the lowest, dirtiest corners of the city. There, among the dregs of society, where whiskey and opium dulled the senses, Hyde found himself in company that didn't care about his depravity. Together, they reveled in the filth and indulgence the city had to offer. There were times when I imagined a life of unbridled lust, but the moral strictures of my upbringing had always held me back, forcing me to deny such impulses. Hyde, however, felt no such restraint. His nightly debauchery became a way to clear my mind, allowing me to engage in my daytime experiments with a precision and energy that hadn't been possible before. My desire for Laura even began to subside, and I returned to her with a clearer, less obsessive mindset. Yet, as effective as Hyde's nocturnal adventures were at relieving my tensions, I found myself longing for the experiences I could barely remember. And the price of those nights was becoming steeper. I woke up bruised, battered, and utterly drained. In the weeks that followed, Hyde's activities became more erratic, his presence more dangerous, and our home in Cavendish Square no longer felt safe. One morning, after another night I couldn't recall, Peter informed me that a man named Edward Hyde had broken into the house, demanding access to some papers in the laboratory. Peter had thrown him out, but he was suspicious. He demanded to know how this depraved man had come to know me. I mumbled something about borrowing money, explaining that it had been repaid in full. But Peter remained unconvinced, and as for me, I was shocked. Hyde had named himself. He'd given himself an identity, Edward Hyde. Edward was my own middle name, chosen in honor of my grandfather, and Hyde was a dark, mocking twist, alluding to the stealth of a creature hidden within me. Rumors of the mysterious Mr. Hyde spread through Marylebone, culminating in reports of a brutal attack on a young child. The police were on high alert, and I began to worry for the safety of my home. Hyde, sensing this, moved his nocturnal escapades to Soho, a place more suited to his dark appetites. I hoped this would restore peace to our home, but it was not to be. One night, after Peter had gone out and Mrs. Willoughby and Laura had retired to their rooms, I found myself in the basement laboratory once again. I couldn't resist the pull, and I took the potion to summon Hyde. My transformation was painful, more so than before, and my screams echoed through the house. Laura, hearing them, came to investigate. I remember yelling at her to leave, but the pain quickly overtook me, and the memories from that night became a blur of sensations and darkness. When I woke the next morning, Laura was beside me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. I wanted to speak, but my body was paralyzed, as if I had no control over myself. My head throbbed with a searing pain, and when I stretched, I felt a neatly bandaged bump at the back of my skull. "Did you treat me?" I asked, my voice hoarse and alien to my own ears. She nodded, her expression heavy with worry. "You were asleep for 24 hours, she whispered. The silence between us was suffocating, thick with secrets and lies, regrets and unspoken accusations. Finally, I couldn't bear it anymore. "How much did you see?" I asked, my voice barely more than a murmur. She looked at me, her face filled with pain. "Everything," she said quietly. "You, him. Isn't that right?" I closed my eyes, shame washing over me. What had I done to her? What had the demon inside me done? "Yes," I muttered, unable to meet her gaze. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Why did you?" How could I explain it to her? How could I make her understand that my desire for her, my need to protect her, had driven me to this madness? That I was responsible for creating the monster that had likely harmed her? I turned away from her, hiding my face, ashamed of my own weakness. Behind me, I heard her choke back a sob, and then the sound of her footsteps as she fled the room. My body recovered quickly, but my spirit did not. Laura never returned to my room after that day, and she avoided my laboratory as if it were cursed. The distance between us grew, and I could feel the weight of her unspoken accusations pressing down on me. For my part, I resolved to rid myself of Hyde for good. Once my strength returned, I cleaned out the laboratory, destroying the potions and substances that had fueled my transformations. Peter helped me, just as eager as I was to banish the monster from our home. As we worked, I told him everything that had happened in the past months. I saw something like compassion in his eyes, maybe even pity, but I couldn't dwell on it. The important thing was that Hyde had to be removed from my life. But Hyde proved more resilient than I had expected. A month after the attack on Laura, I found myself back in the laboratory, frustrated and disheartened by the failure of yet another experiment. Though I had given up on my transformation plans, I was still determined to find a way to control the angels and demons warring within me. I aimed to create a substance that could calm the demons without feeding them, a remedy like laudanum, but without the sedative effects. But as the failures piled up, my frustration boiled over. One night, after yet another experiment went wrong, I lost control. I screamed in fury and hurled the flask against the wall, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. I collapsed on the floor, overwhelmed by my failure, my heart racing, my breathing labored. My mind was filled with thoughts, screaming for release, begging for some kind of resolution. Would I ever achieve my goals? Would I always be met with obstacles, forever thwarted in my attempts to control the forces within me? And then, a cold calm settled over me. Why, I thought, was I wasting my time in the lab, chasing after one failed experiment after another, when all of London lay at my feet? Why was I fighting to maintain the pretense of being the virtuous Dr. Jekyll, when the joy and freedom of Hyde were mine for the taking? I was bliss. I was ease. I was Hyde. When I woke the next morning, I was in an unfamiliar room, the scent of cheap gin and sweat clinging to the air. A woman lay beside me, her thick hair spilling across my chest. I didn't know her, but it didn't matter. Carefully, I freed myself from her embrace, quickly dressed, and left the house. As I walked through the streets of Soho, I realized what had happened. My body had transformed without the potion, without my consent. A week later, it happened again. I woke up in a strange bed, my clothes reeking of smoke and alcohol, my body exhausted and bruised. And again, 3 days later. The transformations were happening on their own now, the result of the knowledge I had instilled in my own body. It had learned to transform, even without the potion. At first, I prayed that it was a fluke, an anomaly. But it became clear that this was only the beginning of something far more sinister. The more it happened, the more frequent the transformations became. I could see the pattern emerging. If nothing changed, I would soon be Hyde permanently. The prospect of losing myself entirely, of being consumed by Hyde, was terrifying. And to make matters worse, Hyde still had his sights set on Laura. In fragmented memories from his time in control, I saw her through his eyes, sleeping, vulnerable, watched by a predator. The thought filled me with dread. I was left with only two options. On one hand, I could continue to give in to Hyde, allowing him to take over completely until there was nothing left of me. On the other hand, I could end my life, taking Hyde with me. The second option, though drastic, would at least protect Laura, and the world, from the monster I had created. The decision was clear. I had to die. It was the only way to stop Hyde and protect the woman I loved. I had to end it all before it was too late. I had identified the poisons that would allow me to leave this world with minimal pain and difficulty. Consulting my notes, I concluded that a combination of laudanum and arsenic would be more than sufficient. The intervals between Hyde's appearances were growing dangerously short, and the threat he posed to Laura was becoming unbearable. There was no reason to delay my departure any longer. That night, I wrote a brief farewell letter to both Laura and Peter, explaining my decision as succinctly as I could. After consuming the substances, I returned to my bedroom, awaiting the final release of death. As I closed my eyes, I wondered if I might meet Collins in the afterlife. Would I finally have the chance to apologize for everything? But when I awoke, I found myself not in some ethereal heaven, but in a blindingly white room filled with light. For a moment, I thought perhaps the religion of my childhood had been correct, but the headache pounding in my skull and the bitter taste in my mouth soon dispelled that notion. "You're awake," whispered a familiar voice. It was Laura. I turned my head weakly to see her leaning over me, her eyes swollen and red from tears. She didn't like what she saw in my expression because her face hardened, her eyebrows furrowing with anger. "How could you?" she hissed, her voice shaking with both grief and rage. I can't control him anymore," I said, my voice cracking. "He's trying to destroy me." Her face twisted, and she abruptly turned away from me, walking out of the room without another word. In the days that followed, Peter filled me in on what had happened. Instead of granting me a peaceful exit from life, the poisons I'd ingested triggered another violent transformation into Hyde. Fortunately, the laudanum and arsenic weakened him, causing him to pass out soon after his metamorphosis. I slept for 2 days afterward, my body recovering from the ordeal. When I finally awoke, I explained everything to Laura and Peter, the accelerating pace of the transformations, my belief that Hyde had become a growing threat to Laura, and the desperate reasons behind my actions. At first, Laura listened quietly, her face impassive. But as she realized that part of my motivation had been to protect her, her expression changed. Rage flooded her face, and before I could react, she hit me. Peter had to restrain her, guiding her out of the room. Later, after she had calmed down, Laura returned, composed but resolute. She told me she had found my laboratory notes and had studied them thoroughly. With her newfound knowledge, she declared that we would work together to find a potion that would heal my soul, expelling Hyde once and for all. Though I appreciated her determination, I couldn't help but make a sarcastic remark about her apparent penchant for witchcraft. She replied with a sharp jab about how I should stick to medicine, since comedy clearly wasn't my strong suit. Despite the tension between us, we forged ahead, and Hyde's attempts to resurface were kept at bay, though not without consequence. As part of our efforts, we began tying me to the bed every night to prevent Hyde from taking control. While these precautions worked, they brought their own problems. The opiates we used to suppress Hyde's transformations became a growing addiction for me, and Laura had to help wean me off them, a painful process that tested both her resolve and my own. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of struggle, we developed a compound that seemed to repair the damage Hyde had done to my body and soul. Over time, we reduced my dependence on laudanum, though the withdrawal process was brutal. Throughout this, Hyde remained subdued, and for the first time in a long while, I began to hope that I might be free. One morning, I woke up to find Laura standing beside my bed. Disoriented from the near transformation the night before, I looked at her, my heart softening as I wondered aloud, "Why do you spend so much time trying to save me?" She gave me a look that suggested I was out of my mind. "I can't just abandon the man I love to his mistakes," she replied, her tone sharp but full of emotion. I turned away, not wanting her to see the tears welling in my eyes. But she wasn't having it. She reached out, gently turning my face back to hers. "What's going on, Henry? I can't love you," I whispered, my voice breaking. Her face hardened into a look of determination. "That's ridiculous," she said. "I've seen it in your eyes since the day we met on the train to London. You love me." I groaned, feeling the weight of her words. "Yes, I love you, Laura. But I can't condemn you to this, to live with me, knowing the evil inside of me. I can't defile your life with my sins." She pursed her lips, that familiar expression of stubborn resolve settling over her face. "This is the price, Henry. The price of bringing you back. You're mine now, and I'm not going to let Hyde take you from me." I couldn't help but smile, despite everything. "So, to be clear, you're saying I either devote myself to you, or you leave me to Hyde. For a brilliant doctor, you're surprisingly slow-witted," she whispered, her tone soft but teasing. Something inside me melted at her words. I had resisted for so long, but now, faced with an impossible situation, I realized that sometimes, the wisest thing to do is to give in. September 15, 1893. I began to wonder if there was any discernible pattern to my transformations. Yesterday, I retraced my steps through my journals, starting with blood tests from the last time I had transformed uncontrollably. As before, I found no trace of the chemical connections that had once triggered the change. There were no shifts in diet, no heightened stress levels that could explain the transformation. My daily routine had followed the same trajectory as always, nothing out of the ordinary. I plotted the nights when I experienced vivid dreams and woke up feeling exhausted, suspecting those were the times I had transformed. But when I compared the dates, I found no clear pattern. There was no connection to the days of the week, the phases of the moon, or any other natural phenomena. I even went so far as to compare the dates to the liturgical calendar, but not even the Church of England held the answers to my mystery. Though I was disappointed by the lack of clarity, I also felt a glimmer of hope. Unlike before, the transformations weren't accelerating, nor were they slowing down. As far as I could tell, they were occurring in an almost entirely chaotic manner. On a larger scale, they seemed to happen about once a week, though the randomness gave me reason to be cautiously optimistic. However, the constant uncertainty caused me a great deal of anxiety, which I feared could trigger another spontaneous transformation. Not wanting to resort to laudanum again, I turned to alcohol, increasing my intake to help calm my nerves. One evening, during a rare dinner with Laura, I poured myself a third glass of wine, unusual for me. I glanced up to see Laura staring at the decanter, her expression tense. "Do you want some, love?" I asked. "No," she murmured, briefly meeting my eyes before quickly looking away. Something about her gaze unsettled me. It was intense, almost secretive. After finishing my wine, I retired to the living room, and later, to bed. That night, I dreamed of Hyde again. September 19, 1893. I woke up with blurry memories of Hyde and of Laura. I remembered her eyes, the way they had looked at me with a mixture of defiance and submission. The struggle in her gaze haunted me as I ate breakfast, where she once again avoided conversation and quickly left, claiming urgent matters to attend to. As I reflected on her strange behavior, I realized that I was alone in the house, a rare occurrence. Laura usually locked herself in her greenhouse, but today she had left. Something in her expression the previous night had nagged at me, and a creeping suspicion began to form in my mind. Could she be involved in my transformations? Her absence provided me with the opportunity one needed. I decided to search her greenhouse for answers. Finding her personal diaries wasn't easy, but I quickly located the notebooks on her desk. They contained detailed records of her work, formulas for treating cramps, irregular menstruation, and other so-called women's ailments. It was exactly the kind of research I would expect from a chemist like her. But the meticulousness of her notes seemed too perfect, too staged, as if they were meant to throw off any intruder. I wasn't fooled. Laura was clever, more clever than I had ever imagined. I searched every corner of the greenhouse, even looking behind the lithographs of plants that decorated the walls. Finally, I discovered a secret compartment in one of the desk drawers. Hidden inside was a small stack of leather-bound diaries. I opened the most recent one to a random page in the middle, dated June 7, 1893. After many late nights and countless hours of study, I've succeeded. I've transformed again, and now my research can continue. He's even agreed to support me in my quest for knowledge, though I wonder what price I'll have to pay for his existence. And how will I ever earn Henry's forgiveness? This is a great step forward, but it comes at a cost. Still, I must continue. If there's one thing Henry has taught me, it's that scientific discovery demands a high price, and loyalty is measured by the willingness to pay. But even now, I can't bear the thought of being in debt to a man like Edward Hyde. Excerpts from the Memoirs of Laura Jackal. By the time the summer of 1893 had turned to autumn, my relationship with Henry, once marked by an almost supernatural closeness, lay in ruins. And I am afraid the fault lies with me. My secret experiments had become a secret life. I found it increasingly difficult to maintain the intimacy, intellectual or otherwise, that had been the cornerstone of our marriage. Outwardly, nothing had changed. We still shared meals, exchanged pleasantries, and even continued to sleep in the same bed. But the meals became less frequent, the conversations grew strained, and the bed felt colder each night. To society, we appeared to be the perfect couple, perhaps even exceptional by their standards. But we were never conventional, and what might have seemed acceptable to others was, for us, a harbinger of coldness and alienation. I can't say for certain how Henry perceived this growing distance between us. He had never been particularly talkative or outgoing, and as far as I knew, I was his only confidant. My increasing reserve must have taken him by surprise. He made several attempts to understand the reasons for our estrangement, but while his intellect excelled in the laboratory, it wasn't suited for unraveling emotional intricacies. I easily deflected his inquiries until, eventually, he gave up. He retreated into his laboratory, drowning his frustrations in alcohol, while I found myself torn between my interest in Edward Hyde and my affection for Henry. What had begun as a scientific endeavor, a quest for knowledge, had transformed into a betrayal. I couldn't separate the two anymore, and even though I hadn't planned for it to happen, my obsession with Hyde was destroying my marriage. My only hope was that my experiments would reach their conclusion before they completely shattered what remained between Henry and me. By early October, that was where we stood, two people trapped in a marriage of silence and unspoken truths. I was a wife who could no longer meet her husband's gaze, and he was a husband who was ill-equipped to bridge the emotional gap that had come between us. We continued to play the roles of a proper couple, keeping up appearances for Peter, Mrs. Willoughby, my parents, Bedford College, and perhaps, most pathetically, for ourselves. October 6, 1893, was a Friday. As usual, Henry and I had breakfast together before going our separate ways. He went to Bedford to give a lecture, and I retreated to my greenhouse to work on processing samples. I had been studying the diffusion and absorption of certain catalysts in human blood cells. Before leaving the house, Henry gave me a meaningful look and asked if I would join him for dinner that evening. I blushed, feeling the weight of all the dinners I had missed recently. I smiled weakly and promised that I would. I have no idea what Henry did after his lecture. Perhaps he spent time at his gentleman's club or tinkered in the basement lab. By then, our relationship had deteriorated so much that we rarely saw each other, even in our own home. For my part, I spent the morning working on my samples. When they were finished, I knew I would need to collect more, a task that filled me with both self-loathing and a guilty excitement. But at that moment, the self-loathing won out, and I hesitated. Soon enough, it was time to prepare for dinner, another painful evening of trying to ignore the confusion and hurt in Henry's eyes. Dinner was uncomfortable. The food, though as masterfully prepared as ever by Mrs. Willoughby, tasted like ash in my mouth. My discomfort in Henry's presence, combined with the anticipation of seeing Hyde later that night, left little room for culinary appreciation. I glanced at Henry, and for the briefest moment, his eyes pierced mine. There was something different about them. Their usual icy blue seemed faded, dulled by an emotion I couldn't quite place, contempt, perhaps. I quickly averted my gaze, staring down at my plate. Though I hadn't intended to entangle myself with Edward Hyde, I couldn't deny that the man fascinated me. Since our first encounter at 17, Cavendish Square, I'd been drawn to his strangeness. But after our second meeting, I turned against him, repulsed by his predatory nature. I shared Henry's mistrust of Hyde, who had once tried to take over his body. Yet, I couldn't shake the memory of Hyde's intense brown eyes, the ferocity of his attention. These memories left me unsettled, torn between fear and fascination. Despite my obsession, I had been relieved when Henry, Peter, and I had driven Hyde from our home. If not for my father's deteriorating condition, I might never have sought out Hyde's company again. In 1880, my father's war wounds had set me on the path to scientific study. Over the years, his body healed, and much of his former vitality returned, but his spirit never fully recovered. A decade after his return from the war, his health began to decline rapidly. His joints stiffened, and walking or riding became excruciatingly painful. The activity he loved most, riding horses, was no longer possible, and without it, his spirit withered. By Christmas of 1891, during a visit to our family estate, I was shocked to see my father transformed into an old man. Dr. Whitestone's diagnosis confirmed what I suspected: my father suffered from rheumatic gout. Though the treatments, laudanum, salicylic acid, and warm baths, offered some relief, they did little to restore his mobility or vitality. Frustrated by my father's condition, I became determined to find a way to inspire the body to heal itself. During my research, I became fascinated by metamorphosis, particularly in organisms that could dramatically transform, such as amphibians and insects. I wondered what natural force allowed such creatures to change so completely and whether the human body held the same potential for transformation. After all, humans do change, albeit gradually. We grow, we heal, we shed skin and hair, but at some point, that process slows down, and entropy takes over. Could I find a way to reverse this process? Could I force a body to heal itself, even in old age? This was the question that haunted me and led me to consider Henry's strange relationship with Hyde. My husband had achieved something extraordinary: he had found a way to remold his body and psyche. But his method was far from refined. Despite his best efforts, his mastery over his transformations was erratic. Yet, the results were undeniable. In Hyde, Henry had constructed a completely separate persona, with physical attributes that were distinctly different from his own. Hyde was stronger, more agile, his reflexes quicker. Even his features, though nearly identical to Henry's, seemed animated by a different energy. While Henry was quiet and controlled, Hyde was wild, impulsive, and consumed by the pleasures of the world. Henry recoiled at Hyde's appearance, but I found myself intrigued. Despite my initial relief when Hyde was banished, I now regretted the struggle that had cast him out. "Don't you like the food, dear?" Henry's voice snapped me out of my reverie. I forced a smile, my heart sinking at the question. Yes, it's delicious, I lied. The truth was, nothing tasted right anymore. Even Mrs. Willoughby's finest dishes couldn't stir my appetite. I glanced at Henry again, but his eyes were hidden in the shadows, full of secrets I didn't dare explore too deeply for fear he might uncover the ones I held in my own. As I sipped my wine to hide my discomfort, I thought about Henry's transformation technique. His methods had been crude, relying on psychoactive substances to fragment his personality and force his body to respond to different aspects of his psyche. Edward Hyde was simply the animalistic part of Henry, given flesh. My research, on the other hand, was more refined. The compounds I had studied with Mary Draith, the midwife from my parents' village, were also psychoactive, but they acted more gently, subtly. While I was relieved by Henry's healing, I couldn't help but feel a sense of loss at Hyde's absence. In Hyde, Henry had unleashed desires he had long suppressed, and by banishing Hyde, he seemed to have banished all passion from his life. Henry had always been frighteningly proper, but now he was practically glacial. Yet, as we worked together side by side, I began to feel a glimmer of the connection that had once bound us so closely. It was not the wild, reckless passion I had felt in Hyde's presence, but it was something, a spark, perhaps, of the bond we had once shared. I realized just how deeply and passionately I was connected to Henry, the good doctor, and over time, he made it clear that my feelings were reciprocated. A year after Hyde's ghost was laid to rest, we married, becoming husband and wife. Yet, I won't pretend that memories of Hyde's intrusive advances didn't resurface from time to time, or that my pulse didn't race when I recalled the sensation of his hands on my skin, his teeth on my neck. However, those memories were more intellectual than physical, more a curiosity about the miracle Henry had created than any lingering desire. As my father's condition continued to worsen, I resolved to repeat Henry's experiments. I wanted to find a way to heal my father, to relieve him of his suffering. But I soon encountered several major obstacles. First, I had to devise a less destructive method of transformation than Henry's approach. Henry had poisoned himself repeatedly, enduring unbearable pain to trigger his metamorphosis. That was no way to heal my father. I needed something gentler, something that would heal without causing agony. Second, I didn't have the same resources as Henry. I wasn't willing to test my compounds on myself, nor could I acquire test subjects as readily as he had. Most of Henry's experiments at Cambridge had been conducted on individuals from the lowest rungs of society, people desperate enough to sell their bodies for a few coins and a drink. For me, such methods were neither safe nor acceptable. Still, I wasn't without resources. Through my contacts at Bedford, I gathered a small group of test subjects, low-paid employees and a few scholarship women. With their help, I tested several of my psychoactive compounds under controlled conditions. However, given the nature of my subjects, I couldn't attempt the more dangerous experiments Henry had conducted. Although I managed to create a number of psychoactive elixirs, I couldn't replicate Henry's success in triggering a full-body metamorphosis. Part of the reason, I suspected, was that I lacked the crucial understanding of the actual compounds that had caused the transformation in Henry. It was then that I came to the inevitable conclusion: I already had in my possession the only person who, to my knowledge, had ever undergone such a transformation, Henry himself. If I could somehow force him to become Hyde again, I could analyze his blood and isolate the compounds responsible for the change. Once I identified them, I could master the process of bodily evolution. In theory, I could then manipulate this process to inspire growth, healing, or any number of mutations that the human body undergoes naturally during life. I might even be able to heal my father's bones, strengthen his muscles, and calm his spirit. It was a monumental task, but it was the only way to ease my father's suffering. This was the first step toward what would ultimately become my greatest betrayal of Henry. By that point, Henry had developed a deep-seated hatred of Hyde, a fixation, even. Hyde represented, for Henry, a terrifying loss of control, a surrender to something primal and irrational. After the events of 1886, Henry became obsessed with maintaining strict control over his emotions, which extended to every part of his life, from his work in the laboratory to his behavior in the bedroom. There was, I believe, a part of him that yearned for the freedom Hyde represented. But this desire was overshadowed by the horror he felt at losing himself. If I were to force Henry to transform into Hyde again, I knew I would have to do so in secret. I needed to create an elixir that could be administered without his knowledge, perhaps in food or drink. The transformation would need to occur after he had gone to bed, in the safety of the bedroom, and the effects of the elixir would need to wear off before morning. It had to be undetectable. I started by revisiting the psychoactive compounds I had used in my earlier experiments to suppress Hyde. My goal was to induce a kind of mental disturbance that would prompt the transformation, without causing the extreme physical pain Henry had endured. I also needed to ensure that the transformation was temporary, so I incorporated copper sulfate into the elixir, an emetic that would help purge the toxins from Henry's body within 6 hours. Copper sulfate was well documented, and through careful experimentation with my test subjects, I was able to refine the dosage to control the duration of the transformation. I added a short-acting sedative to ensure Henry would sleep through the initial stages of the transformation. Over time, I perfected the formula. The final product would put Henry to sleep shortly after dinner, induce his transformation into Hyde within 90 minutes, allow me several hours to observe and experiment, and then return him to his natural state before he awoke in the morning. The first time I attempted to use the elixir on Henry, I took precautions. I waited until he was asleep, then tied his wrists and ankles to the bedposts. At first, he slept soundly, but as the transformation began, he stirred. His body tensed and stretched, testing the limits of the restraints. His muscles seemed to grow more defined, and his features sharpened in subtle but undeniable ways. When he opened his eyes, they were no longer the familiar blue of my husband, they were brown. A smile spread across his face as he blinked, surveying the room. "Where am I?" he demanded. "You're in the home of Dr. and Mrs. Henry Jekyll," I replied. "Jekyll," he spat, his face twisting with disdain. Then his gaze returned to me, and his smile reappeared. "But you. I remember you." His voice dripped with familiarity. "My sweet bird. It's so nice to see you again." I flushed, my voice betraying my nervousness. "Good evening, Mr. Hyde." He glanced down at his wrist, noting the rope that bound him to the bed. "And now you're Jekyll's wife. How things have changed." He smiled again, but when he tried to raise his hand to touch my face, he found himself unable to. His smile faltered. "Why am I tied up?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "I don't recall you having these particular inclinations." "You're secured for my safety, given our previous encounters," I said, trying to maintain a steady tone. "I suppose I can understand that," he said, his eyes flashing with hunger. "You are an irresistible temptation, after all. But you must see that I mean you no harm. Perhaps you could loosen these ropes." "I'm afraid I'll have to leave them in place for now, Mr. Hyde." His smile twisted into a grimace as he tested the ropes again. After a few moments, he relaxed and sighed. "So, what shall we do then, Mrs. Jekyll? Shall I be your toy for the evening?" I stiffened. "This is not that kind of evening." "Then what kind is it?" he asked, his smile widening, clearly enjoying my discomfort. "Shall I entertain you with stories? Dance for you, perhaps?" I took a deep breath. "You are going to be the subject of a study, Mr. Hyde. I plan to take some samples." "Samples?" He frowned. "Of what?" "Just a little blood. Maybe a hair or two." He stared at me, his expression darkening. "I'm afraid things won't go as smoothly as you think, Mrs. Jekyll." The next 2 weeks proved Hyde right. On that first night, he broke 3 needles and a syringe when I attempted to draw blood. The following week, after another attempt and more broken needles, I noticed raw abrasions on his wrists from where he had struggled against the ropes. "I see you're beginning to understand," he said with a grin. "You won't be able to get what you want without my cooperation. And without samples, your little experiment will fail. Have you found a solution?" I shook my head. "You'll need my help," he said, his smile never fading. "And if you want it, you'll have to negotiate." When Hyde awoke the next night, I didn't tie him up. But I wasn't entirely unprepared. I kept a pistol close at hand, ready in case things went wrong. Hyde sat up in bed, stretching his arms before flashing me a wide grin. "I see you're ready to negotiate, Mrs. Jekyll," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. I tightened my grip on the pistol, standing my ground. "Let's negotiate, then." He raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying himself. "Very well. Tell me, what exactly do you want from me?" I straightened my posture, ready to meet his challenge. "I want to understand the process of transformation. And I want your cooperation." I wanted Hyde's cooperation for my experiments, and in return, I offered him the opportunity to exist consciously, a gift he hadn't experienced in years. But Hyde, ever the opportunist, wasn't satisfied. He grinned when I mentioned the samples: blood, hair, skin, even urine, making an inappropriate comment that sent a hot flush to my face. Yet, despite my discomfort, Hyde didn't miss a beat, and his smirk grew wider. "What will I get in return for these services?" he asked, his tone full of mischief. Caught off guard, I stumbled over my words. I don't know. You'll be here, alive and aware, more than you've had for the last 7 years. He seemed to consider it, but then winced, his lip curling. "True, but what's life without experience? The idea of waking up only to be trapped in this perfect little house isn't particularly appealing." His eyes glinted with challenge. "I can't let you roam freely," I admitted. "You'd inevitably find your way to some other house, and my husband would wake up in a strange bed. He would realize what's happening." Hyde raised a brow. "I could promise to come back every night." His grin widened. "But I think you already know why I wouldn't trust such a promise." I hesitated, trying to grasp control of the situation. I suppose I could accompany you," I offered, my voice faltering. His smile turned predatory. "Ah, Mrs. Jekyll, I knew you would be tempted. But I will demand more." "What do you want?" I asked, dreading the answer. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with dark intent. "I want you." My heart raced, my mind spinning. "What do you mean?" "Let's not pretend," he said, his tone now bored, as if this was all a tiresome game. "You want my cooperation, and I want yours. But not just in the lab." I was shocked. Not only by his words but by the rush of emotions, shock, excitement, guilt, that surged through me. Decency demanded I refuse, but I found myself grappling with conflicting desires. I can't. I'm a married woman." He laughed, the sound dark and mocking. "A minor technicality, Mrs. Jekyll. After all, you're married to me, in a way." "Nonsense," I stammered. "I'm married to Henry Jekyll." "Henry and I share the same body," he said, his eyes narrowing. "And time is running short. Will you come with me, or will I seek my pleasures elsewhere tonight?" I was desperate for a way out, searching for some alternative that wouldn't destroy my marriage. In hindsight, I see many choices I could have made. But at that moment, my mind was blank, torn between my obligations to Henry and the thrilling allure of Hyde. I tried to rationalize it. After all, Hyde and Henry were technically the same person. I convinced myself that I wouldn't be breaking my vows if I gave in. "Okay," I whispered. "Let me take my samples, and then I will be yours for the night." Hyde frowned. "No, Mrs. Jekyll. That's not how deals are made. I think we should seal this agreement with a kiss. Come to me." My feet moved of their own accord. "Stop," Hyde commanded. "But on your knees." Even months later, when I looked back on that night, I remembered the flood of emotions that overwhelmed me, guilt, excitement, and fear all mingling together. I had crawled to him, knees scraping against the floor. When I reached his feet, my face flushed with shame, I pursed my lips and kissed him. He responded by gripping my hair tightly. "Such a sweet kiss," he murmured, his voice mocking. "No wonder poor Henry is so indecisive, getting this kind of affection. But I am not so patient." We didn't leave the house that night. Instead, I collected my samples, but I gained something darker, an experience that both terrified and thrilled me. That night marked the beginning of a routine. Once a week, I would bring Hyde out, and in the intervening days, I processed the blood samples I had collected. But despite my hopes, the results were disappointing. Hyde's blood was almost identical to Henry's, with no significant differences except a slight increase in white blood cells. I started to develop new tests to better understand the chemical composition of his blood, but progress was slow, as if I were blindly throwing hammers in the hope of hitting an unseen target. And yet, I continued to meet Hyde every week. At first, our interactions were confined to the house, but over time, Hyde grew restless. His demands became more insistent, and I felt powerless to refuse him. By July, he was pushing to leave the house, and despite my reservations, I eventually relented. Our first outing together was to a seedy inn, the Grey Goat, where Hyde had once been a regular. I was his prize for the night, displayed on his arm like an exotic pet. People stared, not recognizing the academic or the daughter of a baron, they saw me as something much lower. Perhaps they saw me as Hyde's possession, or maybe just another woman he had corrupted. During that night, a man tried to pull me away from Hyde, claiming I wasn't fit for his company. Hyde's reaction was swift and violent. One moment, the man was laughing with his friends, and the next, he was on the ground, Hyde's hand around his throat. The sight filled me with both terror and excitement. As we left, Hyde's dark influence consumed me, and I found myself surrendering to him completely. I realized, as I tore Hyde's shirt off later that night, how far I had fallen. I had begun this journey as a researcher, determined to uncover the secrets of Henry's transformation. But now, Hyde was no longer a test subject, he had become my lover. I had gone from reluctant participant to willing accomplice in my own downfall. As I threw away his ruined shirt the next day, I knew something had to change. I could no longer continue my meetings with Hyde. But despite my resolve, my separation from him only lasted until September. The bruises and bite marks faded, but so did the fleeting sense of normalcy. Henry remained distant, and our home became cold and quiet. The rift between us widened, and I wondered if I had irrevocably damaged our marriage. I wasn't just missing Henry, though. I was missing Hyde, too. He had awakened something primal within me, and now, in his absence, I felt the pull of that same animal nature, clawing at my insides. My research stagnated, and I realized that I was no closer to understanding the secret of Henry's transformation. So, in early September, I brought Hyde back, fully aware that I wasn't just resuming my experiments, but also giving in to my darkest desires. Our first night together was an intoxicating mix of pain and pleasure, and I barely remembered to take the blood samples I had set out to collect. By the second night, the experiments felt like an afterthought, a formality before I surrendered to the man who both terrified and consumed me. I had fully committed to the path I'd chosen, even though it felt like an inevitable descent. My mind was consumed not only by my desire to uncover the mysteries of Hyde's transformations, but also by the dark, unfamiliar cravings rising within me. That night, as I knelt before him, naked, in the position he preferred, I felt an anticipation mixed with dread. Hyde grinned down at me, undoing his trousers, and I could feel my body reacting, betraying me. Later, we returned to one of his old haunts, a seedy, dimly lit place filled with unsavory characters. He seemed especially lively that evening, more eager than ever to parade me around like a prized possession. We sat at a long table with his companions, and I quietly sipped my drink, trying to regain some composure. My heart raced, but eventually, I managed to settle my breathing, forcing my mind back to the task at hand. As I glanced around the table, I noticed Hyde engaging in hushed conversations with the other men. They seemed to be coming to some sort of agreement. His voice cut through my anxious thoughts. "Here's my little bird," he purred, "have you come back to us?" The men's laughter echoed around the room as my face turned red. "Yes, I'm fine," I replied shakily, embarrassed by the attention. They found my response amusing, their laughter only intensifying. Hyde leaned in close. "Good, good," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "I'll be going out in a minute." Fear gripped me instantly. "What?" I asked, panicking. I'll pack my things and go." "No need, my dear bird," Hyde replied, his voice disturbingly calm. "Tom will take care of you." I looked across the table at Tom, a large man with a ruddy complexion and a grin that widened as Hyde spoke. Something inside me froze, cold, terrified. "No, Mr. Hyde," I said firmly, "that won't happen." Hyde's hand gripped mine like a vice. "Who do you belong to, Mrs. Jekyll?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "To you, sir," I whispered, feeling the weight of his dominance. "Very good," he crooned. "As one of my things, I decide what you do and with whom. If I choose to give you to someone else, you go." My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew I couldn't allow this. With a surge of defiance, I grabbed a knife from the table and pointed it at him. "I will not share my body with anyone else," I hissed. Hyde didn't react with anger or violence. Instead, his grin widened even further, his eyes sparkling with some dark amusement. He glanced at Tom, then back at me. "Sorry, Tom," he said with a smirk, "looks like the ladies decided against it tonight." Tom's face flushed red with embarrassment. "But, you said," he began, clearly frustrated. Hyde cut him off. "I know what I said, Tom. Plans change." His tone was light but firm. "Do you want to discuss this outside, or are you going to accept it?" Tom's face paled, and he backed down, muttering, "Yes, Mr. Hyde. Plans change." Hyde's fingers threaded through my hair, yanking it gently but firmly. "Shall we leave this fine establishment, my little bird?" he growled softly, pulling me close. "The night is still young." "Yes, Mr. Hyde," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I think I'm ready to leave." The memory of that night washed over me as I sat across from Henry at the dinner table, my stomach twisting in knots. I could feel the sweat trickling down my neck as my inside seemed to writhe with an unsettling pain. My limbs felt heavy, contracting painfully, and I could barely hold myself upright. Henry," I gasped, my voice trembling with fear. What's happening to me?" Henry's expression was cold, distant, as he calmly replied, "It seems you've eaten something that doesn't agree with you, dear. I'm sure it will pass." The pain grew worse, tearing through my body like fire. Tears streamed down my face as I struggled to breathe. "Henry, what did you give me?" His smile was devoid of warmth, a chilling, calculated grin. "Something familiar to you, my dear," he said, his tone dripping with cruel amusement. "Perhaps a little strychnine. I hear you've grown fond of a little pain." I stared at him in disbelief, my vision blurring as the room spun around me. "Oh, God. Henry." "Potion, yes, you could call it that," he said nonchalantly. "Don't worry, it won't kill you. But things are about to get interesting." As I gasped for air, struggling against the waves of agony ripping through my body, I looked up at Henry one last time. His eyes, normally a piercing blue, were now interspersed with a sickening brown hue. My world faded to black. Step back into the shadowed streets of London on June 21, 1893, where we follow a personal account of a man whose life teeters between love and loss, curiosity and danger. This gripping narrative draws us into the heart of a marriage where intellectual passion once burned bright, but now flickers weakly under the weight of unspoken truths. Our protagonist shares a rare moment of connection with his wife, Laura, during a lunch that sparks memories of their early days together, a time filled with vibrant conversations and mutual discovery. Yet, something has changed. Despite outward appearances of love and devotion, he senses an undeniable rift between them, a growing distance that neither intellect nor passion can seem to bridge. Their deepest connection has always been in their meeting of minds, but now, even those sacred exchanges are fading. As Laura drifts further away, consumed by thoughts unknown to him, he finds himself questioning their bond, even contemplating seeking affection elsewhere. In a poignant recollection, he reflects on the beginning of their relationship, when Laura's sharp intellect first captivated him, far surpassing the shallow concerns of her sisters. Together, they built not just a life, but an intellectual partnership that pushed the boundaries of science. But now, he fears the woman he once knew is slipping away, becoming a stranger in their own home. As Laura's physical discomfort grows more visible and her behavior becomes more guarded, the mysteries surrounding her deepen, leaving him unsure of the future. This is a story of love struggle, of a mind grappling with emotions too complex to unravel, and a marriage at a crossroads. With evocative imagery and haunting reflections, our narrator takes us through the challenges of holding on to a love that once seemed unbreakable, but now feels like it's slipping through his fingers.